Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, meine Damen und Herren, vielen Dank, dass Sie zu diesem Hauskolloquium am Deutsches Archäologischen Institut gekommen sind. Ich bin Rose Gillis, ich bin die Leiterin für die Archäozoologie at the Deutsches Archäologischen Institut in Berlin. Heute ist ein großer Freund, Professor Umberto Albarella, hier zu haben, um uns einen Überblick über die Archäologie der Tiere in die mittelalterlichen England zu geben. Albarella betrieb ein sehr aktives Zooarchäologenlabor an der Sheffield Universität innerhalb der weltberühmten Archäologenabteilung, die leider geschwungen wurde, schließen. Und das Labor von Albarella sieht in einer neuen Abteilung um. Ist ein inspirierender Lehrer für die jungen Wissenschaften und seit den 19 Jahren arbeiten an den Material an ganz Europa und Eurasien mit einem besonderen Fokus auf die Schweine. Nochmal vielen Dank für Ihr Kommen und ich freue mich, Ihre Fragen an die Ende des Vortrags in die Chat and die weiter. So, thank you very much for just suffering my awful German there. I'd like to welcome Professor Umberto Albarella. I mean, it's a great pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for coming and giving us a talk on the archaeology around us in the Middle Ages. I just want to mention that his, if you didn't catch it in the awful German, that his lab was threatened with closure with the Department of Archaeology. It is going to survive, but unfortunately the department is going to be closed, which is a real shame to science in general and the archaeological community. Anyway, it's a really great pleasure. I've got something else to say from the administration. Feel free to ask your questions at any time in the chat by clicking on the blue icon at the bottom right-hand side of the page. And if you're watching us on YouTube, in the YouTube chat, we'll collect questions and pass them on to the presenter. And just if you want your name mentioned, just make sure you add that in as well. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Ross. It's really a great pleasure to be here. This is the conventional way to start, but there is something that is really special for me about being in Berlin, and that's for a number of reasons. One of them is I have family in Berlin, although I'm Italian and I live in England, but I have family here, so I have been coming to this city for more than 30 years on a rather regular basis. And then I have also had work connections here for a long time. It's great to see my old friend Norbert Benneke here, who I visited in this institute more than 20 years ago, and before him I had links with Hans Hermann Müller, somebody that people in the zooarchaeology world we recognize as a real pioneer. Okay, so it's really nice to see that these people are still around, still active, we're still friendly, and also there is a new generation coming. So I'm very grateful to Ross for the invitation, and it's really, really a great pleasure to be here with you. Okay, regarding the point that Ross made that concerns the closure of my department, I will mention something at the end about this, and I'm also wearing the Save Sheffield Archaeology t-shirt that we made during our campaign to save the department. Okay, the talk today is, I was a little bit unsure about what to present But eventually I decided it's something I have worked on for most of my career, which is basically the relationship between people and animals in the Middle Ages, and especially became a very prominent part of my work when I moved to England 30 years ago from Italy. So I think some of the information I will present is actually very old research, some others is actually very recent, because it's a bit of a combination. And also this is a modified version of the introduction, the keynote speech I gave at the meeting of the ICATS medieval group that met in Bergen a few months ago, which was a fantastic meeting organized, among others, by my former student Veronica Anici. Right, I would like to start, you might be surprised, with a book on medieval England, because I just wanted to give you a slight kind of personal perspective into my approach to the subject. I really was mainly focused on prehistory in the earlier part of my career when I worked in Italy. My background is in natural sciences, and then I got involved with Roman archaeology and kind of early medieval archaeology in Italy. But then when I moved to England, this was a new world for me, and I thought I need to understand something about the history of the country, and I was working on a medieval assemblage, so I thought I have to really try to figure out a little bit about the broader background. And so I thought there was this book called Medieval England, which seemed to be ideal for me, that had been published a few years before. We are talking about the early 90s here. So I read this book, and the whole book, there was just one very brief mention of animals. Okay, just one. And then I thought, these people in England in the Middle Ages, either they didn't have animals, or there is something maybe not quite right in the approach of the archaeologists and the historians. So obviously there is a lot that needs to be done, and to integrate, maybe it's our fault also as archaeologists, as people who study animals from archaeological sites, we are not giving the message strong enough that the human-animal relationship is an essential part of our history. So I dived into the subject rather enthusiastically, because I believed that that integration was needed, and the human-animal relationship deserved a greater role in the history of the country, but in fact probably the same issue would have applied to other countries too. Okay, so in this talk I will deal with the three main areas which I think are probably interesting and very much associated with history and broader archaeology. And on purpose I want to start with social status, because sometimes archaeologists are accused of only caring about food provision and economy, and they don't pay enough attention to the social and the more kind of cultural dimension of our society. I think it's a very unfair criticism, and because we have all been working on all the aspects, but I think this is a good place where to start. Okay, so talking about medieval England and social status, probably the first thing that may come to mind is deer hunting. The reason why is because deer hunting was a privilege of the aristocracy. Of course, not just in England, but in many other European countries. But we know that well for England, and many high-status sites have been excavated, and in many of them we do find a very clear indication that deer were regularly hunted in castle sites, to some extent also in manor houses, but mainly in the very high status sites. Okay, this is probably for most people rather obvious, so I don't want to spend too much time on that, apart from saying that the archaeological evidence is there and absolutely confirms our historical perspective and perception. But I want to go into the detail of something that has to do with the different types of deer. So in this slide here, you can see representation of two types of deer. One here is the fallow deer, and that's the red deer. There is a third species of deer present in Britain, which is the roe deer, which I'm not going to discuss because it does play a slightly lesser role in the story, although it's interesting in many other respects. But the relative importance of these two species for the British aristocracy in the Middle Ages is actually quite a fascinating story. And if we want to look at some of the data regarding the proportion of the bones of these two species in different high status sites in different periods, if we start from the early Saxon, which is basically the in English terminology, so the very beginning of the Middle Ages after the end of the Roman period, and gradually we move chronologically our way through the post-medieval period, you can see that the red deer that is here represented with a white bar becomes less and less common in comparison to the fallow deer, which is represented by the black bar. So basically, largely after the Norman invasion of the 11th century, gradually fallow deer became the species that had been more commonly hunted. And why was that? Well, first of all, the fallow deer is an introduced species, it's not a native species. Therefore, it was introduced, and clearly it was introduced for a purpose. And what we find, especially in the kind of mature Middle Ages, is that many of the high status sites had deer parks. Okay? And the deer parks, again, this is something that we know from other parts of Europe, and in these deer parks were absolutely ideal to host the fallow deer, which is a species which has its very early origins in the Middle East and was eventually spread to other parts of Europe. Okay, the Romans were the first to introduce it, but only very partially. It's only in the 11th century that it became more common in different parts of Europe, including England. So probably the main reason why fallow deer became so popular is because they were the ideal animal to be kept in the deer park. The red deer hunting went on, of course, but the red deer was a creature more typically associated with the forest, although you could find the red deer in deer parks. Okay, so basically the archaeological evidence, the evidence from the animal bones, is telling something about some kind of development in the way these high status sites were organized and structured and the hunting took place. Deer hunting in itself was an insufficient mark of status. And one thing that we know, and this is where we have very clear archaeological evidence too, is that the different parts of the deer, and that applies both to the red deer and the fallow deer, had different meaning to people and different value. Okay, this is again is a well-known kind of high-status medieval practice. And this is just an example from one of my very early work in England, working on the material from Lonsdale Castle in Cornwall. And you can see here the distribution of body parts of the fallow deer, and these are the cranial, the teeth, which basically are representation of the cranial elements. These are the forelimbs, and look at the hind limbs are much better represented. So why is there this very uneven representation? Why are the hind limbs so much better represented? Well, we have this same pattern in quite a few other sites, and that we know that this is associated to a practice which is well described in historical literature, which is normally known and reported as the unmaking of the deer. You know, which is a kind of was a very ritualized activity in which the deer was killed first during the hunt and then slaughtered and butchered in a very kind of symbolically important and ritualized way, and different parts of the deer would go to different people. And this is well described in the literature. The picture you saw before actually comes from France, because this is where this practice originated. It did originate from France, and then it was exported to England, and this is from a famous late medieval hunting book by Gaston of Hipes. But here is a report of, you know, from kind of the medieval, the English medieval literature, and says that the unmaking was a recognized way of doing everything. Formulate cries, commands, and whole calls, ritualized ceremonies, and the most striking imposition of ceremonial activities came after the death. Okay, so after the death, when in the flaying and butchery, so what is called the unmaking of the animal. So that was very important. And it's said, but we don't know to what extent that this is partly mythological and partly true, but we know it is partly true because we have the archaeological evidence for that, you know, it's said that the pelvis would go to the crows and the ravens, the left shoulder to the hunter who was working for the nobility, the right shoulder to the forester, and what is key in the interpretation of our Lonsdale custom material is that the haunches, which basically is the hind limb, would go to the Lord. Okay, so what we have in the archaeological evidence is not just an indication of status on the basis of the fact that the deer were hunted, which was not allowed to people of lower status, but also that only the best part of the deer carcass would be used by these people of very high status. So here we are with the opportunity for archaeology to basically provide some very clear status indicators. There are many others, and I will just give you quickly some examples. I mean, for instance, what you see in this slide is that at the top is the mandible, the lower jaw of a young goat, and here is a young sheep. Sometimes people wonder why are archaeologists spending so much time agonizing about the separation of sheep and goat. In fact, actually, the two animals could be used in different ways. It's important for us. And we know this is a goat. If you look at this little kind of appendix here to the tooth, this little pillar here, this is typical of the goat, not the only character to be used. And this again goes nicely at the present. So the goat is generally rare on British medieval sites, but some of the young, very young kids are quite regularly present in very high status sites, and that fits well with historical evidence that says that both the milk of the mother, but also the meat of the young kid would be regarded as a very high status food. Okay, so that's another indicator. And then of course birds, I mean, one of the probably the best possible indicator of status is actually variation. Okay, you see it also in our world nowadays. You know, a rich meal is a meal which is made of many different things. you know, and people who are better off have the opportunity to have a more diversified diet. This was also the case in the past. And therefore, those assemblages from high status sites which have lots of fish bones and bird bones and a great variety of mammals are much more likely to be those of people from the high status. So, talking of birds, you know, there were some things that also suggest that in some respect it's not the food that was important, but it's the display, it's the gesture. So, this is a post-medieval quote about cranes being tough and not really good, and you know, this funny reference to engendering a melancholic blood. But the reality is that we know from both the archaeology, because we find the crane bones on high status sites, and also the history descriptions of medieval banquets and so on, that actually cranes were very highly prized by the aristocracy. Okay, and I mean, I have never tried crane. I don't know if anybody here has, but it does make sense that it's a rather tough bird. But the point is that the cranes would be served at this high status banquet, not because they were really so good to eat, but they were served because it was a great display. You know, can you imagine, you know, a crane on the table, and many other things like this, you know, swans and so on and so forth. So obviously, you know, the aristocracy was very keen to show that not only they could eat lots of different things, but that they had access to a great variety of different resources, which was definitely not the case for poor people. I mean, if we look at the archaeological evidence again, for instance, one typical bird is the swan, and here you see the proportion of frequency of swans on rural sites in this kind of light blue, and in green is on urban sites, and on high status sites they're much more common, and other wild birds, the difference is even bigger. The only wild birds where there is actually quite a bit of presence, as much as in high status sites, is waders, and probably because many of these would be hunted on estuaries, and there would be access also to the waders by kind of lower status people. But clearly, the overall story is that you would expect to eat bird meat more often if you were rich. Other indicator status, again, another one that me like look obvious is falconry. Clearly was a privilege of the aristocracy. In different ways, it's actually interesting. Different raptors would be used by different people in the aristocracy, and occasionally we find archaeological evidence for that. So these are, for instance, the remains of a goshawk skeleton. That this actually was found in an urban site rather than a castle, but the goshawk and the sparrowhawk are known to have been used also by people who were not of the highest possible status. And the goshawk was typically used also to hunt ducks. So again, these are useful indicators. I think quite a long time ago, I did also more work on the bird bones, and one thing that actually was very interesting was actually to find out that in the course of the Middle Ages, in fact, the number of wild bird species had a tendency to increase. So here, for instance, you see a contrast between two very kind of broad chronological periods going from the 9th to the 14th century, but towards the end of the Middle Ages, we see an increase in the number of species of birds and the number of bones, bird bones. And I think the way we interpreted this, trying to integrate it with historical evidence, is that while in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, meat consumption in itself would be a very powerful symbol of status. Actually, meat consumption towards the end of the Middle Ages, especially for the urban population, was becoming more widespread. So eating meat was becoming not quite enough to show that you were high status. It's a little bit like it would be nowadays. If you say, if I have eaten some meat, it's not that impressive. But if you say I have eaten a crocodile fillet, that would make a different impression. But anyway, so it does look like in the later medieval period, people felt more the need to distinguish themselves, not just by eating meat, but eating a much greater variety of meat types, which probably explains why in the later period we get a greater number of birds. Okay, sometimes we find other things that could be interesting, sea resources, dolphin bones, whale bones, that again, for instance, these were found on inland sites, so they were obviously brought there. And then, not everybody would have the opportunity to have access to these resources, so these are other indicators of potential high status. One bird which I found it was really fun to look at and intriguing is the monk's shearwater. I don't know, many people may not be familiar with this bird, but this bird is a very strictly pelagic bird. Okay, so very strictly marine. It only nests on islands. Okay, and we have found it. I first was very intrigued when I was working again on the Mammatia from Lumsden Castle in Cornwall, which is an inland site, where we found quite a few bones of this bird, and all were from the hind limb. Okay, they were almost all tibiotarsi, apart from one female, which was very intriguing. Eventually we found from the historical evidence that in fact, because then the question is, where are they coming from? How come they ended up, this very strictly marine bird ended up on a castle which is inland? And then we found that the Earl of Cornwall had leased the island of Scilly to the Abbot of Blackminster, and having in exchange a certain number of puffins. Now, puffins are not puffins in the old language, but they are actually monk's shearwater, and the Latin name of the monk's shearwater is Puffinus puffinus. Okay, so they were getting these birds, which obviously would be a quite fancy thing to have. Obviously, they were collected from islands. So it's very, very difficult to hunt these birds when they are flying on the sea. You have to get them when they are still relatively young from burrows. So you have to go to the islands there. So this is where the site is, okay, and this is where the islands there are there. So of course we have more evidence for that, but I can elaborate on the up to point. Okay. I want to finish this kind of theme of the social element just by mentioning that so far I have actually discussed the fact that zooarchaeology, the study of animal bones from archaeological site, can provide us with some indicators of very high status. But in fact, actually, there are some opportunities sometimes also to look at animals which didn't quite have the high status that perhaps a swan or a red deer would have, but they were still valuable, but to a slightly lesser extent. And one of these is the hare, okay? And so hare hunting, to what extent lower class people could hunt it, is a bit ambiguous from the medieval literature. It's not that clear. It's probably varied in different times and different places. And so, but one thing that was interesting, here I'm just comparing hare bones, the frequency of hare bones compared to dog bones. Why am I using dog? Because I'm using an animal which is domestic, but it's not wildly different in size. Okay, there is no point in comparing hare with cattle. zooarchaeologists here would know that it's a comparison that is totally affected by recovered bias. Okay, and one thing that was interesting here is you look at this top diagram is that the hair is actually quite common in these sites which are manor houses. Okay, so these are not quite the castle sites. Some are castles too, and it can be quite common there, but also in manor houses which wouldn't have many deer. And in the lower diagram is just the relative proportion, so it's the same data showing the relative proportion of dog and hare. And if you look at these sites here, apart from this, these two are castles, but these two are manor houses, and you see hare is very common in comparison to dog. And when we move here to sites which are lower status, the opposite is the case, and you will see it also here, where the dog becomes more common. So this is basically an area that requires more work, but there are hints that the zooarchaeology may actually provide us some information, not just about the highest possible status, but also degrees of status that could be not quite as impressive as the highest possible. And another species that would probably follow a similar trend to the hare is the roe deer, which I mentioned at the beginning as the third of the deer. And the roe deer was definitely not as valuable as the red or the fallow deer, but still had some kind of status, was still a wild resource. Okay, so it's expected, when I say kind of high status site but not the highest status, could be kind of wealthy people living in manor houses, or even merchants, rich merchants living in urban areas and so on. That's kind of people. Okay, so now I want to move to another subject. And I just want to mention something about the contrast between town and country. And I think that is a very, very important issue for the medieval life, and also because he really distinguished the society in a very stark way, and as we will see. Okay, so let me show you some examples. First, I just want to acknowledge the fact that one of the reasons why we can do this work is that back in the 70s and 80s, urban archaeology really developed very strongly in England, and this is because of a lot of developers' work, but also there was some attention to develop it almost as an independent field. And there were quite a few research groups working on that. Most prominent, there was a group in York with the Environmental Archaeological Unit there, which had different specialists dealing with animal bones, with plant remains, with human bones, with insects, and others. And this was wonderful. It really was a major breakthrough in our understanding of the urban environment, which in the traditional archaeology had been a little bit neglected. It's no longer the case, thanks also to these people. It's a bit sad that all these research centers have disappeared. Okay, they've gone during the years because the society is moving in a different direction, and there was a very strong feeling that the past didn't really matter that much. Yeah. So, if we want to concentrate on the urban environment first, I think one of the things that I have always found it interesting, how we define a town. Okay, and of course archaeologists, historians, urban developers, sociologists and so on have discussed this issue for a very, very long time. But as an archaeologist, I have found always that it was quite handy. As an archaeologist, especially studying the human-animal relationship, that actually quite a good way to define a town is that it's a place that can't feed itself. Okay, so it's reliant on resources that come from elsewhere. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's not productive at all, but it's not productive to the point of feeding entirely itself. So where is this food coming from? Or, and when I say feed itself, I don't mean just the diet, but it also means resources that you need for life. So they could come from estates and farms that are in the countryside, because of the town hinterland itself, it could have areas, productive areas. Obviously, as I said at the beginning, some comes from the town itself. It would be a mistake to regard the town as a purely consumer site. Of course, there is an element of production, and then, of course, from the wine. Okay, so it's interesting to bear this in mind in the background by looking at the evidence that I'm going to discuss in a minute. So now, one of the very simple things that the archaeologists do, one of the first things we do is we look at the proportion of some of the main domestic animals. Okay? Forget about the red and blue, they are just different quantification system. I'm not going to bore you with that, but it's reassuring, and they show more or less the same story. So, these are rural sites in central England in the Middle Ages, and this is the proportion of cattle, sheep, with some goats in it, but it's mainly sheep and pig. And when we look at the urban sites, remarkably, the proportion is not so different, okay? It's still pig tends to be the third most common animal, but one thing that quite regularly we find in urban sites that there are more cattle borns, okay? And why is that? Why there is this trend, okay? It's not an absolute reality, it's a trend. But before I discuss it, one thing that it's very, very important to remember is that the zooarchaeological evidence reflect consumption, not production. Okay, so if we find that the bones of a cow in a particular site, this is where it's very likely that the cow was perhaps maybe slaughtered, but certainly butchered and consumed. Okay, the cow didn't necessarily live there. Okay, it may have been lived there. That's something that is important to bear in mind for our interpretation. I will come back to this point in a minute. Okay, one reason why there might be more cow bones in urban sites is that actually in the perception of for a number of reasons, in the perception of medieval people, actually beef was more valuable than mutton. Okay, clearly in the urban environment you would get all kinds of people, people who were rich, people who were poor, some of them couldn't afford to eat any meat at all. Okay. However, the towns certainly, especially towards the end of the Middle Ages, had enough people who could afford to eat meat and to eat good meat, and therefore this is why we may find more beef. The other thing is, the other reason is purely practical, is that when you have a small rural community and in a period where refrigerators didn't exist, and also preservation of meat would be expensive, using salt, drying, smoking, whatever, but it's quite an expensive and time-consuming practice. To slaughter and butcher a large animal like a cow is actually quite a job, okay? So people had ways to do that, like organizing village feasts and so on, but it certainly was a practical issue. I remember many years ago I was invited to a pork roast party. So there was a quite small pig that was roasted there, and it was a really, really big party, big party, and there was absolutely no way that we could eat the whole meat. Okay, so imagine a cow, which is a lot larger than a pig, and this was a young pig, So the amount of meat that you can get from an animal that's just been slaughtered is quite considerable. and can feed lots and lots of people. So in an urban environment where you have a big concentration of people, and you can have a developed system of meat distribution, you know, driving cattle there, slaughtering there, distributing the meat there was probably easier than in the kind of small village context. How about the age of the animal? This is just a photograph of an unfused cattle bone indicating it's a young animal. One thing that is one pattern which is quite interesting is if you look at different categories here or age groups, mainly juveniles, adults, this is kind of wide range, but basically largely if you go from left to right, the age of the animals increase, and the two bars, so the grey and the black, indicates different periods. So the black is the Saxon to early medieval, and the grey is the late medieval to post-medieval. But without spending too much time on this diagram, I just want to focus your attention on this category of mainly juvenile, which is only represented for the late medieval, post-medieval period. And that is just an example of something. This is basically a summary of many sites from central England, but I know that we have the same pattern in other parts of the country. And these juvenile animals start appearing from the 15th century onwards, and this is basically an indication of veal consumption. Okay, veal is very valuable, and again, that's an indication that the urban population included people who could afford some rather fancy meat. Okay, so that overlaps with the social element I was discussing. But let's go and look at the rural side. Okay, so that's a village side, and here is a very crude analysis of body parts. And it shows the skull, the meaty bones, and the feet. Okay, and then you can see that in the two periods of this rural site, West Scotland here, the proportion is quite similar as far as the skull is concerned, and as far as the feet are concerned. But actually, there are more meat bones. So there is a higher proportion of meat bones in the early medieval period. So what happened in the late medieval period? What happened to those bones? Well, it's quite likely that the people in the later Middle Ages here were actually selling them outside. You know, so basically they were going, these were animals that lived on site, were slaughtered on site, probably butchered on site, but then sold off. Okay. And what's happening in the later Middle Ages to explain this pattern is basically this is the period where we have the development of a market economy. Okay, markets start flourishing in English countryside, but also in cities and so on, and therefore the opportunity to have that kind of trade and selling off part of your animals increases very, very substantially. And those bones, some of those bones, probably end up in the towns, okay? And they contribute to that kind of higher proportion of cattle in urban context. Another thing that really characterizes the urban environment more than the rural environment is that lots of the industrial activities were actually concentrated in towns. In a way that is almost counterintuitive, because some of the industrial activities could be smelly, could produce lots of waste that is actually difficult to get rid of, and in an urban environment could be awkward to do that. However, to put the industrial activities in town has the great advantage that you have a concentration of different activities associated with each other. So just to give you an example, this is an assemblage of foot bones of sheep from Norwich, one of the most important medieval towns in Britain, and the site is called Norwich Castle, but the material doesn't come from the castle, it comes from the town. And it's probably material that is associated with tanning activities, okay? So the tanning, in order to produce hides and skins and so on, hides and pelts and so on, it was an activity that was typically concentrated in towns, where it was handy that it would be close to other trades, like the slaughterhouse, and the people working the bones, and the people getting the fat from the bone. So there is a whole chain of initiatives and activities that are close to each other. In a way, if you think this is what a town is about, this is why towns exist, because you have that handy opportunity to concentrate a number of activities in relatively small places. There are interesting aspects that sometimes maybe not so pleasant, especially for cat lovers in this room, including myself. And for instance, some of the towns we see a quite developed and regular activities of cats, or skinning of cat bones. You can see example here. This skeleton here may look like a complete skeleton of a cat, and it is, but actually if you look more carefully, there are cut marks here on the skull, on the mandible, and you probably see them more clearly on the phalanges here, the foot bones. Okay, there is absolutely no question about the fact these are skinning marks. Cat pelts were produced, so there is one film, this comes from Norwich, it's my work, but there is one famous case from Cambridge, where there was a well which is absolutely packed with cat skeletons that had, or animals that had been skinned. Okay, and that's the sort of thing that you expect to happen in the urban environment more than the rural environment. Okay. As I said before, I think the towns did have a problem of disposal. However, the historical literature is full of this indication that the people were fined for disposing the dead carcasses in the wrong ways and so forth. And that is a warning about the interpretation of the ecological evidence. And if you look at, this is the frequency of bones on rural sites and urban sites in Central England. And you can see that they are much more common on rural sites, okay? But we must be very careful not to conclude that the horses were more common in villages. The question is, horses would rarely die in towns, okay? So when horses would be used in towns, in market context, for riding, people owned them, but people didn't want the horse to die there because it was a bloody nuisance to try to get rid of the carcass when you went into the city. So normally old horses would be sold to poor peasants. This is what happened, and this is why we have this kind of proportion. And it would be very wrong to assume that horses were more common in the rural environment. Another thing that is interesting is that this is again an example from my work in Norwich, and I just want you to focus on the pig here. Okay, these are neonatal, newborn bones of pigs. Okay, and when you look at the early times, there are some, but not many. But actually, when you move towards the early post-medieval, late post-medieval times, they are much more common. And the cattle and the sheep don't follow this pattern. Okay? Newborn bones are the bones of animals that probably were kept on site. We tend to interpret this in this way. If there are newborn animals, it's very unlikely that they were taken them there. There's no point. They're probably casualties or animals that were bred locally. Okay. So what we see here is probably evidence of a phenomenon that was becoming more common in later Middle Ages and in post-medieval times, which is the phenomenon of the urban pig, which is famously represented in Bruegel paintings like this one. So there were lots of pigs that were kept in towns because they would provide a ready source of meat. And the historical evidence is also full of reference to the fact that pigs would become a nuisance, attack children, and all that. They would become loose, but in fact they were a resource that was there, okay, and could be used. It was different for animals like cattle and sheep that need really, while the pigs could be fed on scraps, you know, the cattle and sheep really require open airs and pastures. It's much more likely that, as you can see this image here, this herd of cattle is entering the town walls, okay? So this is more likely that will happen that way. Although, as I said before, also some bits of cattle carcass could be brought in the town through market activities. Okay, just want to finish by saying something about economic and social change. So changes in time. Okay, and now, you know, I mentioned lots of things that concern very old work I have done, but it is much more recent work. And actually, this is a paper that was published in 2022. And this is my student, former student, Mauro Rizzetto, and I worked with him on this. This was part of his PhD. And what we are looking here is the changes in time. And the first thing I want to mention to you is what happens at the very beginning of the Middle Ages. Because for a very, very long time, there's been this idea that the size of animals, which was kind of improved in Roman times, okay, then declined after the end of the Roman period. Not just in England, but in general, with a gradual collapse of the Roman Empire, okay, and the transition to the early medieval period. But there have been very patchy and incomplete work done on really comparing the size of animals between the late Roman and the early medieval period. And here we did, with Mauro's PhD, we really did a quite extensive work, and you can see the ranges here, and if you follow the means here of the late Roman period, which is the Roman is in white, and the early medieval is in green, and you can see that this is cattle, I should have said, I failed to mention it's cattle, and you can see that overall we see a decline in size. What's happening here is very, very substantial change in the society, in the organization of society, with the end of the Roman period. There is no taxation system, centralized taxation system. There is no so much emphasis on production because there is a demographic decrease. And basically the economy starts working in a different way. It's much more small scale, and the small animals can be easier to manage, and there is and also cheaper to keep than the very large animals. So it shouldn't be, I think it would be a mistake to see the decrease in size of cattle between the late Roman and the early medieval period as an indication of crisis or a decline, a cultural decline, an economic decline. It's just a change of strategy. I'll skip this because I think I'm running out of time now. I just want to move totally to the other end of the Middle Ages and just say, okay, these animals during the course of the Middle Ages tend to be smaller than they were in Roman times, and by and large, I want to say, they remain kind of smallish for most of the Middle Ages, but then there's been a lot of discussion about what happens in early modern times. And people in England talk a lot about the agricultural revolution, which is actually a very late phenomenon historically. It's kind of 18th century, 17th to 18th century. And yes, and the traditional historical interpretation is that there is no improvement, no increase in size before the 17th or 18th century. But we have questioned this for a very long time, and again, this is however the more recent work that I did with my colleague Idoia Grau who I was a former student, would be familiar to some of you. And then we decided, okay, is it really, let's focus on the 16th century to try to understand what's happening. And now, I know this is kind of crude analysis, but it's backed up by much more refined analysis. And if you look at cattle here, and the three color lines are lengths, widths, and depths of bones, and this is the size in the late Middle Ages, this is the size in the 16th century, and this is the size in the kind of late and post-medieval period. And you can see, you know, so this is small, this is big. And you can see that these lines very clearly go upwards. And what is very important for us is that already in the 16th century, you have a clear increase in size from the earlier period. I hope you can see that, you know? So the line goes up, that means that the animals get bigger. Clearly the improvement didn't finish there, because you see that the line carries on going upward, but already in the 16th century, unlike the traditional historical interpretation, we have that increase. Okay, so the agricultural revolution may have been important, but in fact, actually, many of the changes occurred earlier. Same thing largely for sheep, although it's not quite clearly, it's not as starking as in cattle, but it's clear enough. And there is something very interesting that happens with pigs. You see, if you look at the pig bones, which are these ones, okay? So pig postcranial bones, so the blue and the red line, you see that the trend is pretty much the same, okay? So again, increase, lot of increase towards the 16th century, and then further increase later on. These lines here, that goes like that, this one and this one, do you see there is some increase towards the 16th century, then there is a decrease. These are tooth size. Okay, so basically, in the post-medieval period, what we see zooarchaeologically is that the pigs just change in shape. Okay, so they do become bigger in terms of body size, okay, but because the skull becomes smaller relatively to the body and also kind of squashed, and the teeth become smaller. And why is that? Because of the strategy of pig keeping changes completely from keeping long-snouted pigs in a kind of free-range system in the forest to keep the animals enclosed, which means that the long snout is no longer needed. And this is why this breeds with a short snout, which we see nowadays very commonly become developed. So this we can demonstrate that archaeologically. It was interesting to do some comparison of that. This is the transition for cattle that I showed you before, with this gradual increase. We have to be careful not to generalize, because Idoia is Basque, and she had access to Basque material, and we look at the pattern in the Basque country is completely different, as you can see. So this is just a warning that what happens in England doesn't necessarily need to be generalized to other regions of Europe. We know there are historical reasons for that, but I won't go into that now. I think I mentioned this before, so I will skip it about the cows in the urban environment. I think one thing that I just wanted to say is that the higher proportion of younger cattle that I mentioned before that happens in the later Middle Ages and in the early modern period is also associated to a change in use, because cattle were, especially as oxen, sometimes as females, were the absolutely key animals used for traction during most of the Middle Ages. Okay, towards the end of the Middle Ages, there is a gradual replacement of oxen with horses. Okay, which means that if you keep animals for traction, you don't want to slaughter them young. Okay, you keep them to an older age, and this is what we see. Younger cattle means less use for traction, and which animal is replacing those cattle that are no longer used for traction is the horse. Okay. As far as sheep is concerned, it's such an important animal for the English Middle Ages. Wool production was the second most important, that sometimes in some periods even the first most important industry in the country. And while historians tend to think that towards the late Middle Ages wool trade was declining, archaeologically we don't see that. And what's our main way to look at this is the age of the animals. Because if sheep were used for meat, we expect them to be younger, but for wool, we expect them to be older. So here in this diagram, we are plotting the age of the animals. This is young, this is old, and here you compare the early medieval period at this site with the mid to late medieval period, and you can see that there is in fact a slight increase in the age. And this is just an example of a pattern that we see in lots of places. Clearly here we are moving from an economy in which there is mixed use of sheep, probably for meat, wool, milk, to a greater concentration in wool production, which was ever so important. The English wool, the British wool, I should say, the British wool was renowned and very important. So change towards older sheep, and then you can see here the shearing of the wool. Okay. The other indicator of that is that even the frequency of sheep tends to increase in the course of the Middle Ages, mainly at the expenses of pigs. Okay, so that's not, we are not talking size here or age, we are talking actual sheer number of bones. And you see they become more and more common. Okay, so that means that the wool really was so key for people, and sheep were becoming more and more important. Why does pig decline? So this pig decrease steadily from Saxon late medieval times, with sheep increases. One of the reasons why pig declines is actually the fact that, as I mentioned before, for most of the Middle Ages, pigs were kept in the forests and kept in this kind of free-range system, but in fact, forests were becoming depleted. Okay, so there is a decline. This system of keeping there was a taxation system in which there would be a swineherd would collect pigs, take them to the forest, and then they would pay something for the people who owned the land, who owned the forest, and that was pannage. Okay, but this system tends to decline towards the end of the Middle Ages, with the pigs becoming more enclosed. But one of the reasons is that there was less forest available. Okay, so yes, reduction in forest cover and also the rise of the sheep. Okay, maybe I'll skip the goat, but if you want to know about goats, ask me later, because I'm going on for too long. I just want to conclude briefly, just saying, I mentioned wild birds at the beginning. It's also important to remember that the domestic birds were actually important for an important economic resource. Chicken, of course, first of all. And one thing that we notice, and I will show you a table, that we see some change in chicken breeding and also in goose breeding. And I will mention it in association to this table, which basically, many years ago, I tried to synthesize what happens in the course of the Middle Ages and what's happening between the early and the later Middle Ages and the post-medieval period. Basically, there is a tendency to have a greater emphasis on meat production, cattle, we saw that traction was its main purpose in the called Middle Ages, but there's more kind of emphasis on meat. For sheep, wool was always the most important product, but towards the end of the Middle Ages, we also have an indication that the meat was becoming a great concern because we have a size increase in sheep. Size increase is not really so useful for wool production, but it is for meat production. So obviously meat was also sought after. Pig, there isn't any change because they were always very important for meat. Horse become the most important animal for traction, but they have never been regularly used for meat. Both domestic fowl / chicken and goose, they tend to have younger birds in the later period, which means that perhaps there is a change in emphasis from egg and feather production to meat production. So overall, what we see is a trend towards our modern society, in which nowadays, but even in the last few decades, actually we eat much more meat than people could ever consider eating in the past. And to some extent, we see the roots of this trend already towards the transition between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Okay, I just want to finish this just saying that going back to what Ross said at the beginning, a lot of this work and 100 times more has been carried out by myself and my collaborators and my students. In the last almost 20 years I've been in Sheffield, and I think we have always gained the reputation of being a very open place and welcoming to collaborations and students and visitors and whoever. And we tried also to have some kind of ethics of helping each other rather than competing with each other. That has always been our ethos. And so it was very sad when 2 years ago we basically had this brutal attack. We have called it an act of cultural vandalism, and that was imposed on us. Is obviously part of a more general trend of the society. People use sometimes in this expression that we move towards a world where people know the cost of everything but the value of nothing, which very much applies to this kind of situation. But I'm proud to say that we fought against it valiantly, and that the world archaeological community has been very much with us. And I'm also pleased to say that we have saved our laboratory, our reference collection, and our team, although we have not saved the department. But I know there are some people online here, but I just want to say that I always say when I talk publicly, I wanted to thank the wonderful, collaborative and supportive archaeological community, because we never ever felt alone in that battle. Thank you very much.
A lot to take in. So, questions. Come on, this is your intimate audience with Umberto. So, I have a question. So, in urban context, you have an increase in juvenile bones. Cattle, yes. Could this be urban milk production?
Milk production,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
I mean, you associate it with veal, and veals are not.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think milk production goes hand in hand with that. The question is a bit like a chicken and egg question: is what drives the thing? Is it the milk or the veal?
Yeah.
Okay. To be honest with you, we don't have a clear answer to that. But what is interesting for us is that this milk production, we know it's not just a random byproduct of milk. People wanted, demanded milk. Okay, so we know that there was a specific interest with that. So I think it's, although it's pretty much impossible to say which of the two elements was the driving force, but certainly milk production opened up perhaps the opportunity to produce more veal, or maybe the demand for veal opened up the possibility of having a parallel milk production. But unquestionably, the two things go hand in hand. But I wanted to emphasize the veal because it was part of my story associated with the urban life. Yeah. Because that's really something that is driven by the urban population. Because so the urban population was demanding more meat and more quality meat than villagers and rural people ever had.
Because in Szmanek, I mean, they had like all those metapods from very young cattle and juveniles. And they were making like loads of vellum, but that's a sort of monastic context. But did you find that in urban context, like
it's actually very rare to find in England. It's very rare to find in medieval sites of any periods very large accumulation of that kind you have described, or that, for instance, we know from late prehistory of young cattle bulls. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be that focus. To the point that, for instance, Finbar McCormick, working in Ireland, and not finding all these young animals, has actually questioned the fact that they are a good indicator for milk production. Yeah. But I think there are a number of complex stories, and as you know, obviously taphonomy and preservation, obviously they represent very important issues that we need to consider, and also the bones are not necessarily found in the place where they were originally discovered. So there is a great complexity in interpretation there that needs to be taken into account. But no larger accumulation of juvenile bones, we don't have that. But we have enough juvenile bones to suggest that there is some association with milk production.
Jana, I would have a question related to the cat and the cat skinning actually. One point would be, is there a difference between the urban towns and rural communities? Because I assume that cats in rural areas would have been valued more as a living being because they had mouse, for example, and in urban it's different apparently. And then more generally, can we see that also in bonus level that the perception of cats changed in the society later on? Like today, we value them as a family member and so on, and would never kill them. And maybe there are also historical resources on like a law not to kill cats or something.
Okay, I think there are two questions here. Yeah. I think in the urban, rural, I think the question is that we do occasionally find skinning marks on cat bones on rural sites too, which I'm sure it means that they were occasionally skinned. They were using skins. I think what is different in the urban context is that we found this kind of rather substantial accumulations of cat bones. It seems that in towns, I think it's too much to call it an industry, but obviously there was something. I think it's probably believable that cat could be kept for their skins.
Why not?
Okay.
Why not? Yeah.
I think in the rural context this is unlikely to happen, but in terms of pest control, they were valued as pest control in all kinds of different contexts. So I think in the urban context it's not that they were doing something they wouldn't do in the rural context, but that they would do it at a greater scale. Okay, there is also evidence from Ireland, so there are quite a few different places in all in towns. I mean, in terms of the change in perception, Certainly there has been a change in perception. I suppose the big question is, when did it happen? I mean, we have absolutely no indication that people would be squeamish about killing cats in the course of the Middle Ages or even in the early modern period. When did they become pets that wouldn't be touched? I don't know exactly. I suspect it's a very contemporary phenomenon, like 20th century. I mean, this doesn't mean that people couldn't have pets or couldn't have affection for these animals in the past. Of course they did. You know, but there are lots of different cultures in the world where you have pets and you love them and then you kill them and eat them. I mean, one classic case I always mention is the piglets in New Guinea, which are actually breastfed by women, and then when they get older, they are slaughtered and eaten. What better example of changing perception in the course of the life of the animals, from breastfeeding to slaughter.
Yeah, these communities probably look at us with us letting living animals in our houses and find that very strange.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Comments? Oh, one more question. I can do it. Anyone chat?
No.
No. I could bore about age of death, or we could all have a nice glass of wine instead. Yeah? Catcheries, going back to cats, like cats breed really fast. And so in the Mediterranean now there's a massive program where they neuter them and you stop these huge, so you can imagine in urban environments like...
Yeah, I think at the time they breed fast, this would be an incentive. I think some of these animals that were skinned were relatively young.
Okay.
Obviously the quality of the fur is better.
I have a question.
Okay.
What fallow deer? Is there any written record when fallow deer was imported to England in larger numbers after the Romans, of course, period? Is there any record?
I think the broad answer is no.
No.
I think it's unclear from written sources. I mean, we know for sure that this happens after the Norman conquest of the 11th century. There are some, because many of the written sources we use, there are accounts and work accounts, economic accounts that talk a lot about farming and breeding, But obviously there are illustrations and also we have, odd references in historical literature. But, with the Normans from the 11th century, we do have fallow deer, and probably they did become kind of introduced in the countryside pretty much straight away. But, you always say that the fallow deer were kind of almost in between the domestic and the wild status. They were kind of tame, kept sometimes in these deer parks. But I think it's pretty quick after the Norman invasion of 1066. Although in the very early times of the Norman invasion, the red deer is still predominant. It's only after a few decades that the fallow deer becomes the most.
It's very interesting because in German medieval sites, fallow deer is nearly missing.
Yeah.
Here and there you have a bone, one bone or two bones in large assemblages.
Yes.
Through all the medieval period.
Yeah.
There's no sign that from a certain period onwards fallow deer is becoming more common.
It's the same in France.
France
Odd enough, considering that it was introduced by the Normans. But that recently I have come across one site, which has not been published yet, from France, which has the kind of number of fallow deer that we have in quite a few sites in England. But also the other thing is that the Normans, if they are the main responsible for the spread of fallow deer, they had a very patchy distribution because obviously they came from Normandy, they invaded England, and then they were in Sicily, and they were in Middle East. But I don't think they were ever in Germany. No, so that could be one of the reasons.
Sorry.
I had actually also one question concerning the bird hunting, where they were increasing in urban cities after some sort of time, right? I was just
not just in cities, in high status sites. Bird species become both in terms of number of species, number of birds become more common in the later medieval period in high status sites.
Okay, in high status sites. So that was actually sort of my question: is that the hunting itself, was it restricted to a specific sort of society in the whole, or a group of society? And
it was, but it depends on the bird.
It depends on the bird.
Yeah. You know, obviously some birds would be regarded, you know, there was no restriction in killing sparrows.
Right.
Okay. And, but there was, obviously, famously, there was restriction in killing swans. Or other large birds. But this is why I showed that the waders that probably were mainly killed during migration on estuaries, this would really not be an area where the aristocracy would be too bothered about. You know, they were mainly interested in restricting activities in forests, in rivers. So, for instance, also freshwater fish. There was a restriction in the fishing of those. So, I think it depends. Not all birds have the same value. I mean, I mentioned the crane, for instance. The crane seemed to have developed this really high status towards the end of the Middle Ages, perhaps because they were becoming rarer. Mm-hmm. And eventually they became completely extinct. Now they come back, but they did disappear from the country altogether. Yeah. So it's actually very interesting because I think each bird really would deserve a very detailed analysis because each one provides different type of information.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we'll end it there. Thank you to those who are online, vielen Dank. And thank you to our guest, Alberto Alvarella.
Thank you.